The throne room. A king whose word is law issues a command that chills the blood of even his most loyal executioners. His eyes burn with a feverish fire. His speech is incoherent. This is not anger. It is disintegration. We are accustomed to thinking that empires are ruled by men. That is a lie. This is the story of how a microscopic enemy, contracted in a moment of secret passion, secretly ruled the world, driving kings mad and destroying nations from within. And today, we will show how the symptoms of one mad monarch can be seen in the decisions that redrew the map of Europe. Let's call this enemy by its name. Treponema pallidum. This microbe is the perfect saboteur. It doesn't kill immediately. It infiltrates the empire's command center, the mind of its ruler, and slowly begins to sever the wires responsible for logic, mercy, and common sense. We won't just list sick kings. We will dissect the political decisions dictated by the disease. Sir William Osler, one of the fathers of modern medicine, said, "He who knows syphilis knows medicine." This was an acknowledgement that this disease is a master of disguise, capable of mimicking almost any other illness. It was called the great imitator for a reason. In its early stages, it mimics dozens of other ailments, from a common rash to rheumatism. It can lie dormant in the body for decades, creating the illusion of a cure. Then, when all is forgotten, it strikes the central command center, the brain. This is why kings continue to rule, unaware that their minds no longer belong to them. This hidden phase, latent syphilis, is like a dormant volcano. On the surface, all is calm for years. But underground, a destructive force builds, preparing for an eruption that will destroy not just the body, but the very identity of the person. The year is 1494. The young king of France, Charles VIII, is assembling an army. His goal, Naples. His dream, to become a new crusader. He is physically unimpressive, but his ambitions are vast. His army consists of 25,000 soldiers, including Europe's finest mercenaries. A colossal force. But Charles VIII was not just leading soldiers into Italy. Unbeknownst to him, he was leading a biological Trojan horse that would change the continent forever. Naples is taken almost without a fight. A triumph. What follows is a bacchanal. The army, from the king down to the common foot soldier, plunges into debauchery. It is here, in the brothels of Naples, that Europe first encounters a new, incredibly aggressive enemy. It doesn't have a name yet, but its symptoms are terrifying, rotting sores that disfigure a person in a matter of weeks. This was ground zero. According to the Columbian theory, the microbe arrived from the New World on Columbus's ships, and Naples became the epicenter of the explosion where it was unleashed. Charles's army retreats from Italy, carrying not gold, but an invisible passenger. Every city on its path becomes a new hotbed of infection. The disease races across Europe like a wildfire, and immediately a war of names begins. The Italians call it the French disease. The French, in retaliation, call it the Neapolitan disease. The Poles call it the German disease. The Russians, the Polish disease. The Turks, the Christian disease. The name of the illness became a political weapon, a way to accuse the enemy not just of aggression, but of biological defilement. You are his advisor. You see how the king changes after the campaign. He is apathetic, his speech is confused, his decisions lack logic, his word is law. He is surrounded by dozens of courtiers willing to do anything for power. To remain silent is to save your life. To risk your head is to try to save the country from a mad captain steering the ship straight for the rocks. Any attempt to point out his madness would be seen as mutiny. In that era, madness was not an illness. It was divine punishment or demonic temptation. To be accused of such was a death sentence. Charles VIII himself dies 3 years later, at the age of 27. The official cause? An accident. A blow to the head on a low door frame, but his body, weakened by syphilis, was like a castle whose supporting walls had been eaten away by termites. The slightest push was enough to cause its collapse. From a medical standpoint, it could have been syphilitic vasculitis, an inflammation of the brain's blood vessels, where even a minor impact can lead to a fatal hemorrhage. Charles VIII was merely the first harbinger. He brought the disease to Europe. But the real horror began when this disease entered a man who possessed absolute, unchecked power and animalistic cruelty. We traveled to Muscovy. At the beginning of his reign, Ivan IV was a reformer, the creator of the Sudebnik, a legal code, an almost enlightened monarch. But after the death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, he transforms into a monster. Historians blame psychological trauma, but an analysis of his remains and descriptions of his symptoms point to another culprit, tertiary neurosyphilis. His mind became a haunted house. The ghost of his dead wife convinced him she had been poisoned. The demons of the disease whispered that enemies were everywhere. The Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, who reconstructed his appearance from his skull, noted a facial asymmetry. This, too, could be a result of neurological damage. The Oprichnina was not state policy. It was a paranoid delusion that became law. Mass executions of boyars, persecution mania, irrational cruelty, these are not just character traits. These are textbook symptoms from a neurology manual, a direct consequence of damage to the frontal lobes of the brain, which are responsible for impulse control and social behavior. His enemies were not real. They were born of a diseased imagination. He divided Russia into the pure Oprichnina and the impure Zemshchina in the same way his mind divided people into loyal slaves and mortal enemies. Let's look at this through the eyes of a boyar. Yesterday, the Tsar was a wise ruler. Today, he sees you as a traitor and orders your family to be tortured. You don't know about the bacterium in his brain. To you, this is pure, inexplicable evil. This unpredictability, born of disease, was the most terrifying weapon of Ivan the Terrible. It was like playing chess with a madman who changes the rules with every move. Today, the rook moves diagonally. Tomorrow, a pawn can capture the king. Life at court became a deadly lottery where logic and loyalty no longer meant anything. Contemporaries describe how in his final years, the Tsar became bloated, his body covered in rotting sores, and he emitted a foul stench. He could not walk. This is a vivid picture of the final stage of syphilis. His famous fit of rage when he killed his own son was not just anger. It was a classic case of an effective outburst in neurosyphilis. Those sores were syphilitic gummas, destroying tissue. His body became a living map of his internal decay. And the murder of his son, followed by days of wild repentance, is a textbook example of the emotional lability caused by damage to the frontal lobes. In the 1960s, Ivan the Terrible's tomb was opened. An analysis of his bones revealed abnormally high levels of mercury, the primary treatment for syphilis at the time. The cure was no less destructive than the disease itself. Mercury exacerbated his paranoia and destroyed his nervous system. The Tsar was being killed by a diabolical alliance. He was trying to extinguish the fire of syphilis by dousing it with the gasoline of mercury. The therapy was often administered in superheated rooms where the patient was smeared with ointment, turning the treatment into a form of torture that only hastened his descent into madness. Ivan the Terrible and Charles VIII were victims of their passions. But the disease also penetrated the most protected bedchambers of Europe into marriages of convenience, not of love. And its method of entry was far more insidious. A royal marriage was not a union of people. It was a deal between states. A princess was a diplomatic package meant to seal a peace treaty. But no one checked that package for a biological time bomb. Her future husband, the king, was often already infected. It was the norm for the nobility. She became an unwitting carrier. Her children, the heirs to the throne, were born with a death sentence already passed. Congenital syphilis explains not only the horrific infant mortality rates in royal families, but also the emergence of strange, sickly heirs. Sometimes its traces can even be seen in official portraits. A saddle nose, deformed teeth. These are not genetic anomalies. They are the stamp of the disease, passed from father to mother and from mother to child. But the infection could also enter the cradle without sexual contact, through a wet nurse. If she was sick, she infected the heir with her breast milk, and vice versa. A sick royal family could infect a commoner, who would then carry the disease further. The court, with its complex network of connections, king, queen, mistresses, their children, wet nurses, functioned as a perfect petri dish. It was specifically designed to sustain the circulation of the bacterium and pass it from generation to generation. But how can we be sure of a diagnosis centuries later? Historical diagnosis is the work of a detective at a crime scene that is hundreds of years old. You don't have a blood test, but you have clues. First, the description of the weapon, the characteristic symptoms from sores to madness. Second, the spent casings found, traces of mercury in the bones. And third, the serial victims, a chain of miscarriages and stillborn infants from the monarch's wife. When all three clues align, the diagnosis becomes almost irrefutable. We see how it happened. But to understand why the disease was so destructive, we need to look inside the human body and see how the great imitator changes its masks. It all begins with a painless sore, a chancre. It appears at the site of infection, and then it disappears on its own. To a person of that era, this seemed like divine intervention. He thought he was cured. In reality, it was the calm before the storm. The enemy had not retreated. It had simply changed tactics. The chancre is the vanguard of the invading army. It establishes a beachhead, assesses the defenses, and then vanishes. The defender relaxes, certain the danger has passed. But at that very moment, the main army of bacteria is already seizing control of all the body's transport arteries. A few weeks or months later, the second stage begins. A rash all over the body, fever, joint pain. This is why it was called the Great Imitator. The symptoms resembled measles, smallpox, rheumatism, anything. This stage could also pass on its own, again creating the illusion of recovery. But the spirochetes were already penetrating the cerebrospinal fluid. The path to the brain was open. A key clue that doctors often missed was a rash on the palms and soles. This is the disease's signature, its calling card. But at the time, few knew how to read it. Imagine yourself as a court physician. You see these symptoms in the king. To call the disease by its name is to accuse His Majesty of debauchery. It's a death sentence. To remain silent is to condemn the nation to be ruled by a madman. The court physician was a bomb disposal expert working with a biological weapon. He could see the timer embedded in the king's brain. Attempting to defuse it by naming the disease could lead to an immediate explosion that would kill him first. Silence gave him a chance to survive, but doomed the entire kingdom to detonation. The strike could come in 10, 20, even 30 years. Gummas, tumors that destroy bones and internal organs. But the most terrifying outcome was neurosyphilis. The bacterium literally devoured the brain. The result? Paralysis, blindness, dementia, megalomania, paranoia. The person everyone knew died long before their body did. Only a mad shell remained. The brain with neurosyphilis is like a library where a vandal is slowly tearing pages from the books. First, the pages with memories disappear. Then, those with logic. Then, with morality and empathy. In the end, all that remains of a great personality is an empty binding. This three-stage attack was designed to destroy the personality, and a destroyed personality on the throne is a destroyed state. Let's look at the most famous example. Henry VIII was obsessed with the idea of an heir. His wives suffered a series of miscarriages, stillbirths, and early infant deaths, a textbook picture of the consequences of syphilis in the father. His desperate desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon was driven by this thirst. He was playing genetic roulette for the future of England. He didn't know that the roulette wheel itself had been broken by his disease, and his infamous festering ulcers on his legs, which drove him to fits of animalistic rage, are today believed not to have been varicose veins, but syphilitic gummas. The Pope refused the divorce, and so Henry, possibly already suffering from megalomania, a symptom of neurosyphilis, does the unthinkable. He severs ties with Rome. He declares himself the head of a new church, the Church of England. An entire nation changed its religion because its king could not produce a healthy heir due to a venereal disease. The English Reformation was not just a theological dispute, it was a political earthquake whose epicenter was located in one man's bloodstream. His personal biological tragedy became a national religious revolution. The consequences were colossal. Religious wars, a redrawn political map of Europe, the rise of England as a naval power. It is a classic butterfly effect. A single bacterium entering the king's body caused a hurricane with the flutter of its invisible flagella, altering the course of world history. This dark history leaves us with 3 lessons. First, an invisible enemy is always more dangerous than a visible one. An invading army can be defeated. But the disintegration of a leader's personality from within is a defeat against which there is no defense. Second, the personal tragedy of a person in power never remains personal. It inevitably becomes the tragedy of millions. And third, the most dangerous madmen often maintain a mask of sanity. This is a medical phenomenon, anosognosia. The brain, damaged by disease, loses the ability to recognize its own defect. The king wasn't pretending to be sane. He genuinely believed in his own righteousness. This is what made his madness so convincing and so destructive. This brings us to the central question of responsibility. The stories of Ivan the Terrible and Henry VIII show that it is impossible to separate the man from his disease. The disease becomes part of the personality, and the personality becomes part of history. It is like a grotesque waltz. The king and his disease are locked in a dance, and it is no longer clear who is leading and who is being led. Their identities merge into a single, destructive movement. That movement is history. Now, a question for you. What plays a greater role in such catastrophes, the personal vice of the ruler, or the relentless biology over which he had no control? Write just one word in the comments. King, if you believe the responsibility lies with him, or disease, if you think he was merely a victim. Thanks for watching.